On a sweltering July evening in 2015, the rolling hills of Willowbrook, Kentucky carried the scent of tobacco fields and summer rain, but fate lurked behind every winding country road. Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old mother of 5, kissed her youngest daughter goodnight and stepped out into the humid darkness with her familiar leather purse clutched in her hand. She drove her silver SUV down the familiar stretch of Highway 62, heading to meet someone whose identity would haunt the tight-knit farming community for years to come. The next morning, her children woke to find cereal bowls empty and their mother's bed unslept in. What happened in those midnight hours would carve a wound in Willowbrook's heart that would never heal, leaving a community haunted by unanswered questions for nearly a decade. Before devouring this story that will shake you to your core, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest investigations into cases that defy explanation. On the evening of July 3, 2015, Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old single mother living in the small farming town of Willowbrook, Kentucky, finished her shift at the local diner where she worked as a waitress. Sarah was the kind of woman everyone knew by name, warm, hard-working, and fiercely devoted to her 5 children, ranging from ages 2 to 16. Her infectious laugh could fill up the entire diner, and her generous spirit made her beloved by both customers and co-workers alike. That evening, Sarah wore a simple sundress, her long brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, and carried the worn leather purse she'd had since high school, the one that contained photos of her children, a few crumpled dollar bills in tips, and the small silver locket her grandmother had given her years before. As she left the diner, Sarah waved goodbye to her manager and promised to cover an extra shift that weekend. Her smile, radiant as always, became the final image burned into the memories of those who saw her alive. Sarah drove her silver Honda Pilot toward the outskirts of town, past the old Methodist church and the abandoned grain silo that had stood empty since the recession hit. She was heading to meet someone, though exactly who and why would become the central mystery that would consume Willowbrook for years to come. As the mother of 5, Sarah rarely had time for herself, but that night, something had called her away from her children's bedtime routine. The only daughter of the Mitchell family to survive to adulthood after her sister died young in a car accident, Sarah was not only the pride of her aging parents, but also the anchor that held her sprawling family together. She dreamed of saving enough money to move her children to a bigger city, maybe Louisville, where they could have better opportunities. She talked constantly about her plans to finish her GED and maybe even go to nursing school one day. That night, Willowbrook was as quiet as it always was. The main street was empty, except for a few pickup trucks parked outside Murphy's Bar. The summer air hung thick with the promise of thunderstorms, and fireflies danced in the tall grass along the roadside. No one could have imagined that in that ordinary moment, a mother of 5 was driving toward her fate. The next morning, when Sarah's 16-year-old son Jake tried to wake his mother for work, he found her bedroom empty. The bed was still made, her work uniform hanging neatly in the closet. At first he thought she might have pulled an all-night shift at the diner, but when he called her boss, panic began to set in. Sarah had never missed work without calling, and she had never spent a night away from her children without arranging childcare. By noon, when Sarah's phone continued to ring unanswered, her elderly parents, Robert and Helen Mitchell, drove to her small rental house on Maple Street. They found the 5 children, ranging from toddler Emma to teenage Jake, confused and increasingly frightened. The youngest ones kept asking when Mommy was coming home, while Jake tried to maintain composure despite the growing dread in his eyes. The Mitchell family immediately began calling Sarah's friends, co-workers, and anyone who might know where she had gone the night before. But their efforts revealed a troubling truth. No one seemed to know exactly who Sarah had planned to meet that Friday evening. As the sun began to set over Willowbrook's tobacco fields, Robert and Helen sat in their small farmhouse kitchen, their hearts heavy with a fear they couldn't yet name. The house felt different without Sarah's presence. too quiet, too empty, too filled with the possibility that something terrible had happened to their daughter. The 5 children were staying with their grandparents now, the youngest asking repeatedly when Mummy would come home to read bedtime stories. When darkness fell over Willowbrook once again, exactly 24 hours after Sarah had last been seen, Robert Mitchell's weathered hands shook as he dialed the Nelson County Sheriff's Department. The words came out in a broken whisper. "My daughter hasn't come home. She's got 5 babies who need her. Please, you have to help us find her." That call marked the beginning of a nightmare that neither the Mitchell family nor the 800 residents of Willowbrook, Kentucky could have ever imagined. A nightmare that would reveal that even in the most peaceful farming communities, where everyone knows everyone and doors are left unlocked, darkness can hide in the most unexpected places. The investigation that would follow would not only tear apart a family and divide a community, but would eventually expose secrets that had been buried for years in the red clay soil of Nelson County. Sarah Mitchell's disappearance was just the beginning of a story so twisted, so shocking, that it would make national headlines and leave people questioning how well they really knew their neighbors. As the phone rang at the sheriff's department that July evening, no one could have predicted that this case would become one of Kentucky's most haunting unsolved mysteries, or that the truth, when it finally surfaced 8 years later, would be more devastating than anyone had dared imagine. When the call came into the Nelson County Sheriff's Department on the evening of July 4, 2015, the duty officer could hear the desperation in Robert Mitchell's trembling voice echoing through the phone. "My daughter Sarah hasn't come home since last night. She's got 5 children who need her. Please, we need your help." The report was immediately forwarded to Detective Maria Santos, a seasoned investigator who had worked dozens of missing person cases in her 15 years with the department. Within an hour, patrol units were dispatched to begin what would become one of the most intensive searches in Nelson County history. Officers began by retracing Sarah's known movements from the evening of July 3rd. They started at Murphy's Diner, where Sarah had finished her shift at 8 p.m., speaking with co-workers who confirmed she seemed her usual cheerful self. The manager, Betty Lou Harrison, told investigators that Sarah had mentioned meeting someone that evening, but hadn't specified who. "She just said she had to take care of something personal," Betty Lou recalled, her eyes red from crying. "If I'd known it was the last time I'd see her." As the search expanded into the early morning hours of July 5th, deputies combed the winding back roads that Sarah would have traveled from the diner toward her home. The Kentucky summer heat was already oppressive at dawn, and sweat beaded on the faces of the search team as they moved through tobacco fields and dense woods. Every passing hour felt critical, and everyone understood that in missing person cases, the first 48 hours could mean the difference between life and death. At approximately 6:30 a.m., Deputy James Crawford's radio crackled to life as he made a discovery that would send chills through the entire search team. Sarah's silver Honda Pilot sat abandoned in a remote area along Bloomfield Road, about 12 miles from her home. The SUV was parked at an odd angle, partially hidden behind a cluster of oak trees near an old hunting trail. The driver's side door hung open, keys still dangling from the ignition, as if Sarah had stepped out quickly and simply vanished into thin air. The scene was both puzzling and deeply disturbing. Sarah's leather purse sat on the passenger seat, contents scattered but seemingly intact. Her wallet contained her driver's license and a few $20 bills, ruling out robbery as a motive. Her cell phone was wedged between the seat cushions, its battery dead. Most haunting of all were the signs that suggested Sarah had left the vehicle in distress. Her sunglasses were broken on the ground beside the car, and investigators found several strands of her long brown hair caught on the doorframe. Detective Santos carefully photographed every inch of the scene, noting the chaotic footprints in the soft earth around the vehicle. The impressions suggested a struggle, multiple shoe sizes, scuff marks in the dirt, and what appeared to be drag marks leading toward the tree line. But the trail quickly disappeared into the underbrush, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. As word of the discovery spread through Willowbrook, Residents began to gather along the perimeter that deputies had established with yellow crime scene tape. Sarah wasn't just another missing person to these people. She was their neighbor, their waitress, the young mother they'd watched struggle to raise 5 children on her own. The whispered conversations carried a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could this happen here? Who would want to hurt Sarah? What about those poor babies? Sarah's parents arrived at the scene shortly after the car was discovered, and the sight of Helen Mitchell collapsing against the hood of her daughter's abandoned vehicle became an image that would haunt everyone present. Robert Mitchell, a man who had worked tobacco fields for 40 years and was known for his stoic demeanor, broke down completely as he stared at the broken sunglasses in the dirt. "She never went anywhere without those glasses," he whispered to Detective Santos. "She's had them since high school. Sarah would never just leave them behind." The Nelson County Sheriff's Department immediately called in additional resources. Canine units arrived from Louisville, their German shepherds trained to track human scent. The dogs picked up Sarah's trail from the abandoned vehicle, leading handlers approximately 200 yards into the dense woods before the scent went cold near a creek bed. The running water had washed away any trace of where Sarah might have gone from there, leaving the search teams frustrated and increasingly worried. As the sun climbed higher on that July morning, bringing with it the oppressive humidity that makes Kentucky summers unbearable, volunteers began arriving from neighboring counties. The search party grew to over 200 people: farmers, shopkeepers, students home from college, and retirees who had known Sarah since she was a little girl. They formed lines and combed through cornfields, checked abandoned barns, and searched every ditch and culvert within a 5-mile radius of where the Honda Pilot was found. Local news crews arrived by mid-morning, their satellite trucks creating a surreal contrast against the rural backdrop of tobacco fields and century-old farmhouses. The story of the missing mother of 5 quickly gained traction, and by evening, Sarah's disappearance was the lead story on Louisville television stations. The coverage showed aerial footage of the search parties, interviews with tearful neighbors, and the heartbreaking image of Sarah's 5 children clinging to their grandparents on the front porch of the Mitchell farmhouse. But as the first day of intensive searching came to an end, investigators faced a troubling reality. Despite examining hundreds of acres and interviewing dozens of witnesses, they had found no trace of Sarah Mitchell beyond her abandoned vehicle. The broken sunglasses and scattered hair suggested she hadn't left voluntarily, but without a body, without witnesses, and without any clear suspects, the case was already proving to be far more complex than anyone had anticipated. That evening, as search teams reluctantly called off their efforts due to darkness, Detective Santos stood beside Sarah's abandoned SUV and tried to piece together what might have happened. The location was significant. Bloomfield Road was isolated, the kind of place someone might choose if they didn't want to be seen. But it was also familiar territory for Sarah, who had grown up in these hills and would have known every back road and hunting trail. The question that haunted Santos and would continue to haunt her for years to come was simple yet impossible to answer. Had Sarah driven to this remote location willingly to meet someone, or had she been forced there against her will? The evidence could support either theory, and without Sarah's voice to tell the story, investigators were left to navigate a maze of possibilities that seemed to grow more complex with each passing hour. As the Mitchell family returned to their empty house that night, 5 children asking when their mother would come home, no one could have imagined that this was only the beginning of a mystery that would consume Willowbrook for nearly a decade. The abandoned Honda Pilot, towed to the Sheriff's Department evidence lot, held secrets that wouldn't be unlocked for years. And somewhere in the darkness of Nelson County, the truth about what happened to Sarah Mitchell waited to be discovered. In the first 72 hours after Sarah's abandoned Honda Pilot was discovered on that remote stretch of Bloomfield Road, the Nelson County Sheriff's Department worked around the clock interviewing anyone who had contact with the missing mother. They spoke with her co-workers at Murphy's Diner, her children's teachers, her neighbors on Maple Street, and the regular customers who knew her by name. But there was one name that surfaced repeatedly in every conversation, spoken sometimes in whispers, sometimes with obvious reluctance. Marcus Howell, Sarah's on-again, off-again boyfriend of 3 years. Marcus, 38, was a local construction contractor who owned a small building company that specialized in home renovations throughout Nelson County. He was well known in Willowbrook, the kind of man who could fix your roof, install your kitchen cabinets, and always seemed to have cash in his pockets, despite the economic struggles that had hit the rural community hard. To many residents, he appeared to be exactly what Sarah needed. A stable man who could help her provide for her 5 children and maybe give her the security she'd been searching for since her divorce years earlier. But scratch beneath the surface, and a more complicated picture emerged. Sarah's relationship with Marcus had been tumultuous from the beginning, marked by passionate reconciliations followed by explosive breakups that had become the subject of gossip throughout Willowbrook's tight-knit community. Friends described a cycle of Marcus showering Sarah with expensive gifts and promises, only to disappear for weeks at a time when things became too serious or when Sarah pressed him about their future together. Detective Santos made the decision to interview Marcus on July 6, just 3 days after Sarah's disappearance. When she knocked on the door of his sprawling ranch house on the outskirts of town, a property that seemed far too expensive for a small-town contractor, Marcus appeared cooperative but visibly nervous. His hands shook slightly as he lit one cigarette after another, and he avoided making direct eye contact when answering questions about his whereabouts the night Sarah vanished. According to Marcus, he had been at home on July 3rd working on paperwork for his construction business and watching television. When Detective Santos asked if anyone could confirm his alibi, Marcus hesitated before mentioning that his business partner Tommy Caldwell had stopped by around 9 p.m. to drop off some invoices. But when investigators contacted Caldwell, his story didn't quite match. He claimed he'd been at Marcus's house earlier in the evening, around 7 p.m., and hadn't stayed long. The discrepancy was troubling, but it was Marcus's demeanor during the interview that raised the biggest red flags for Detective Santos. When she asked about his relationship with Sarah, his entire attitude shifted. The nervousness was replaced by barely contained anger as he described their recent arguments, particularly Sarah's demands that he spend more time with her children and her questions about his frequent unexplained absences from town. Sarah was always trying to control me, Marcus told Detective Santos, his voice taking on a bitter edge. She wanted to know where I was every minute, wanted me to be some kind of father figure to those kids, when I never signed up for that. We broke up 2 weeks ago because I told her I needed space, and she couldn't handle it. But Sarah's friends painted a very different picture of the relationship's end. Jessica Martinez, Sarah's closest friend and fellow waitress at Murphy's Diner, told investigators that Sarah had been the one trying to end things with Marcus, not the other way around. According to Jessica, Sarah had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Marcus's controlling behavior, his unexplained wealth, and his refusal to introduce her to his family or include her in other aspects of his life. She said he was getting possessive, Jessica recalled, tears streaming down her face as she spoke to Detective Santos. Sarah told me just last week that she was scared of how Marcus would react when she officially broke things off. She said he'd been showing up at her house unannounced, following her to work and texting her constantly even though she'd asked for space. The investigation took a darker turn when investigators discovered that Marcus had a history of volatile relationships. His ex-wife, who had moved to Louisville after their divorce 3 years earlier, agreed to speak with detectives and painted a disturbing picture of emotional manipulation and intimidation. She described a pattern of Marcus using his charm to draw women in, then gradually isolating them from friends and family while becoming increasingly controlling and possessive. When I finally left him, he made my life hell for months, she told Detective Santos during a phone interview. He would drive by my workplace, show up at places where he knew I'd be, and spread rumors about me around town. I had to get a restraining order, but even that didn't stop him completely. If something happened to Sarah, I'm not surprised Marcus is involved. Armed with this information, Detective Santos obtained a warrant to search Marcus's property. The search of his house and construction yard yielded several items of interest. Sarah's favorite earrings were found in his bedroom dresser, along with several photographs of her that appeared to have been taken without her knowledge. Most disturbing was a notebook containing what appeared to be a detailed log of Sarah's daily activities: when she left for work, when she picked up her children from school, when she went grocery shopping. When confronted with this evidence, Marcus's story began to change. He admitted that he and Sarah had met on the night she disappeared, claiming she had called him around 9 p.m. asking to talk. According to his new version of events, they had met at the location where her car was found, talked for about an hour about their relationship, and then Sarah had driven away saying she needed time to think. "I swear on my mother's grave, that's the last time I saw her," Marcus insisted during his second interview, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the interrogation room. "Yeah, I still had feelings for her. Yeah, maybe I was keeping track of her more than I should have. But I would never hurt Sarah. I loved her." But investigators found several holes in Marcus's revised story. Cell phone records showed that Sarah's phone had stopped pinging cell towers at 10:47 p.m. on July 3rd, but Marcus claimed their meeting had lasted until after 11 p.m. More damaging was the testimony of a farmer who lived near the Bloomfield Road location. He reported hearing what sounded like a woman screaming around 10:30 that night, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and an engine starting. As news of Marcus's status as the prime suspect leaked to the media, Willowbrook found itself divided in a way the small community had never experienced. Some residents, particularly those who had worked with Marcus or hired his construction company, defended him as a hard-working man who was being railroaded by investigators desperate to solve a high-profile case. They pointed to his years of community involvement, his donations to local charities, and his reputation as a skilled craftsman who had helped rebuild homes after floods and storms. But others, especially the women who had worked alongside Sarah at the diner or known her through their children's school activities, weren't surprised by the allegations. They remembered the bruises Sarah had tried to cover with makeup, the way she would flinch when Marcus raised his voice, and the gradual withdrawal from social activities that often accompanies an abusive relationship. "She was scared," Helen whispered, sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by photos of her missing daughter. "Sarah told me that Marcus had been driving by the house at all hours, that he'd somehow gotten a key to her place and was letting himself in when she wasn't home. She was planning to change the locks, but..." Her voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like a curse. For weeks, Marcus remained the focus of the investigation. Detective Santos and her team analyzed every piece of evidence, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and built what they believed was a strong circumstantial case. The stalking behavior, the inconsistent alibi, the evidence found in his home, and his history of controlling relationships all pointed toward Marcus as the most likely suspect in Sarah's disappearance. But then, in a development that shocked everyone involved in the case, DNA testing on evidence collected from Sarah's abandoned vehicle came back with results that changed everything. The Nelson County Crime Lab had found traces of blood on the driver's side door handle and tested it against a DNA sample secretly collected from Marcus's discarded coffee cup. The results were unequivocal. The blood was not Sarah's, and it was not Marcus's either. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation and the community. If Marcus wasn't responsible for Sarah's disappearance, then who was? And whose blood was found on her car? The questions multiplied exponentially, and suddenly the case that had seemed so clear-cut became murky and uncertain once again. Marcus Howell was officially cleared as a suspect, but the damage to his reputation and his life was already done. He was forced to close his construction business as customers cancelled contracts and former friends turned their backs on him. Within 6 months he had left Willowbrook entirely, moving to Tennessee, where no one knew his name or his connection to the Sarah Mitchell case. For the Mitchell family, Marcus's exoneration brought no relief, only deeper confusion and despair. If the obvious suspect wasn't guilty, Then who had taken their daughter? The question hung in the Kentucky air like summer heat, oppressive and inescapable, as investigators realized they were back to square one in a case that was growing more complex and baffling with each passing day. By October 2015, after 4 months of intensive investigation that had consumed thousands of hours of detective work and tens of thousands of dollars in resources, the Nelson County Sheriff's Department faced a harsh reality that no law enforcement agency wants to confront. Despite following every lead, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, and conducting extensive searches throughout 3 counties, they were no closer to finding Sarah Mitchell or determining what had happened to her on that July night. The DNA evidence that had cleared Marcus Howell remained unmatched in any database, and without new leads or witnesses, the investigation had reached what investigators euphemistically called a plateau. The words that appeared in Detective Santos's case file in November 2015 felt like a death sentence to the Mitchell family. Case status: cold, pending further evidence or witness testimony. Those clinical terms meant that Sarah's disappearance, which had once commanded front-page headlines and round-the-clock investigative attention, would now be filed away in a metal cabinet, waiting for some miraculous breakthrough that might never come. For Robert and Helen Mitchell, the official cold case designation was devastating in ways that people who haven't experienced such a loss could never fully understand. It meant that their daughter, their brilliant, hard-working daughter who had dreamed of becoming a nurse and giving her children a better life, had been reduced to a number in a filing system. It meant that the officers who had become familiar faces during those frantic summer months of searching would move on to other cases, other families, other tragedies. The transition from active investigation to cold case wasn't announced with fanfare or press conferences. Instead, it happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. The daily phone calls from Detective Santos became weekly, then monthly. The media attention that had once brought reporters from Louisville and even Nashville slowly faded as other stories captured public attention. The volunteer search parties that had combed through cornfields and creek beds throughout the summer simply stopped organizing, their members returning to their normal lives, their initial determination eroded by months of fruitless searching. Helen Mitchell, who had always been the anchor of her family, began to crumble under the weight of not knowing what had happened to her daughter. She developed insomnia that left her wandering the house at all hours of the night, checking and rechecking the locks, hoping against all logic that she might hear Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. During the day, she sat for hours in Sarah's old bedroom, which they had maintained exactly as it was the morning she disappeared. Clothes still hanging in the closet, bills scattered on the dresser, a coffee mug with Sarah's lipstick print still on the rim sitting beside her bed. The children, ranging from 3-year-old Emma to 17-year-old Jake, each processed their mother's disappearance in different ways. Jake, who had been forced to grow up overnight, became fiercely protective of his younger siblings while struggling with his own grief and anger. He threw himself into his senior year of high school with an intensity that worried his teachers, as if academic achievement could somehow bring his mother back. The middle children, 15-year-old Madison, 12-year-old Tyler, and 8-year-old Lily, struggled in school, their grades dropping as they dealt with the trauma of losing their mother under such mysterious circumstances. Little Emma, who had barely turned 3 when Sarah vanished, continued to ask when Mommy was coming home for months after the disappearance. Helen would find her standing at the living room window, watching for a silver Honda Pilot that would never return. As time passed, Emma's memories of her mother began to fade, replaced by photographs and stories told by her grandparents and older siblings. This gradual forgetting was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire tragedy. The youngest victim of Sarah's disappearance was losing even the memory of the woman who had loved her most. Each year on July 3rd, the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, the Mitchell family held a memorial service at Willowbrook Baptist Church. In the first year, the church was packed with hundreds of community members, many standing in the aisles as Pastor Williams led prayers for Sarah's safe return and comfort for her family. Local news stations covered the service, interviewing tearful friends and neighbors who spoke about Sarah's kindness and the hole her absence had left in their community. But as the years passed, attendance at the memorial services dwindled. By the third anniversary, only about 50 people gathered in the church pews, mostly family members and Sarah's closest friends. The media attention had long since moved on to fresher tragedies, and many community members, while still sympathetic to the Mitchell family's plight, had grown weary of the annual reminder of the unsolved case that had once consumed their small town. The psychological toll on Willowbrook itself was something that social workers and community leaders hadn't anticipated. The unsolved disappearance created an undercurrent of fear and suspicion that changed the character of the town in subtle but significant ways. Parents who had once allowed their children to walk to school alone began driving them everywhere. Women who had thought nothing of going for evening walks or running errands after dark became hyper-aware of their surroundings, checking their rearview mirrors and avoiding isolated areas. The case also exposed fractures within the community that had previously been hidden beneath the surface of small-town politeness. Some residents believed that the sheriff's department had botched the investigation by focusing too heavily on Marcus Howell and missing other potential suspects. Others whispered that Sarah's lifestyle, a single mother who had dated several men since her divorce, had somehow contributed to her fate. These cruel whispers reached the Mitchell family, adding insult to the injury of their ongoing grief. Detective Santos, who had worked dozens of cold cases during her career, found herself haunted by Sarah's disappearance in a way that surprised her. She kept the case file on her desk rather than filing it away, and she would often spend her lunch breaks reviewing witness statements and evidence photos, hoping to spot some detail that had been overlooked. She maintained contact with the Mitchell family, calling Helen every few months to assure her that the case hadn't been forgotten, even though she had little new information to share. In 2017, 2 years after Sarah's disappearance, the case received a brief burst of renewed attention when the television show Vanished Without a Trace featured Sarah's story in a 1-hour episode. The program brought national exposure to the case and generated hundreds of tips from viewers across the country. Detective Santos and her team investigated every credible lead, from reported sightings in Texas to claims that Sarah had been seen working at a truck stop in Tennessee. But like every other breakthrough that had seemed promising over the years, the television exposure ultimately led nowhere. The reported sightings turned out to be cases of mistaken identity, and the tips from psychics and amateur detectives provided no actionable information. After a few weeks of renewed hope, the Mitchell family was once again left with silence and uncertainty. By 2020, 5 years after Sarah's disappearance, Willowbrook had changed in ways both subtle and profound. New businesses had opened and closed, families had moved away, and new ones had moved in, and the story of the missing waitress had become something that long-time residents would mention to newcomers as part of the town's tragic history. The case had become like an old scar, still painful when touched, but no longer the raw, open wound it had been in those first desperate months of searching. Helen Mitchell's health had deteriorated significantly during those 5 years of not knowing what had happened to her daughter. She had suffered 2 mild heart attacks that her doctors attributed to chronic stress and grief, and she had developed diabetes that she struggled to control. At family gatherings, she would sometimes stare off into the distance, and when asked what she was thinking about, she would simply say, "Sarah would be 40 now. I wonder if she's still out there somewhere, wondering why we stopped looking for her." Robert, now in his 70s, had aged a decade in those 5 years. His hair had gone completely white, and his shoulders had developed a permanent stoop that made him appear smaller and more fragile than the strong farmer he had once been. He still drove past the spot on Bloomfield Road where Sarah's car had been found, sometimes multiple times a week, as if the location might somehow give up its secrets if he visited it often enough. The 5 children, now young adults and teenagers, had learned to live with the permanent uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their mother. Jake had graduated from high school and joined the army, partly to serve his country but also to escape the suffocating weight of the unsolved case that hung over his family. Madison had become something of an activist, organizing awareness campaigns for missing persons and advocating for better resources for families dealing with unsolved disappearances. As Willowbrook prepared to mark the 6th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance in July 2021, few residents expected that the case would ever be solved. The investigation had gone cold years earlier, the media had moved on to other stories, and even the Mitchell family had been forced to accept that they might never learn the truth about what had happened to Sarah on that humid summer night. But sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, cold cases have a way of heating up again. And in the quiet farming community of Willowbrook, Kentucky, secrets that had been buried for 6 years were about to claw their way back to the surface, bringing with them answers that no one could have anticipated and a resolution that would shake the town to its very foundations. On a crisp November morning in 2016, 16 months after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had shattered the quiet farming community of Willowbrook, another tragedy would strike that would deepen the mystery and send shockwaves through Nelson County. Robert Mitchell, the 68-year-old father who had never stopped searching for his missing daughter, set out before dawn for what should have been a peaceful morning of deer hunting on the family's 40-acre property that bordered the Salt River. Robert had been hunting those same woods since he was a boy, walking the familiar trails with his grandfather and later teaching his own children to track deer through the dense Kentucky underbrush. After Sarah's disappearance, hunting had become one of the few activities that could still bring him a measure of peace, a few hours where the constant ache of not knowing what had happened to his daughter might be temporarily forgotten in the ancient ritual of waiting silently in a tree stand, watching the forest come alive with the sunrise. That morning, November 19, 2016, Robert told his wife Helen that he would be hunting the back section of their property near the old tobacco barn that hadn't been used since the price of tobacco crashed in the early 2000s. He packed his thermos of coffee, grabbed his .36 rifle, and kissed Helen goodbye, promising to be back by noon with stories about the deer he had seen, if not the venison they could use to feed Sarah's 5 children, who were still living with them. When noon came and went without any sign of Robert, Helen initially wasn't concerned. Her husband was known to lose track of time when he was in the woods, especially if he was tracking a promising deer sign or had simply found a peaceful spot to sit and think about happier times. But as the afternoon stretched on and the sun began to set behind the bare November trees, Helen's concern grew into genuine worry. At 4:30 p.m., as darkness began to fall over the Mitchell property, Helen called her son-in-law Jake, Sarah's eldest son who was home on leave from the army. Together they drove the property's rough dirt roads in Jake's pickup truck, calling out for Robert and listening for any response from the woods. When they reached the area where Robert had said he would be hunting, they found his truck parked beside the old tobacco barn, his hunting gear laid out neatly in the bed, but no sign of the man himself. Jake, whose military training had taught him to remain calm in crisis situations, organized a systematic search of the property, while Helen called the Nelson County Sheriff's Department. The same deputies who had spent months searching for Sarah were now back on the Mitchell property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they combed through the woods where Robert had been hunting. At 11:47 p.m., Deputy Crawford, the same officer who had discovered Sarah's abandoned Honda Pilot 16 months earlier, found Robert Mitchell's body in a clearing approximately 300 yards from where his truck was parked. The 68-year-old grandfather was lying face down in a pile of fallen leaves, his rifle several feet away, and a single gunshot wound to his chest that had killed him almost instantly. The initial assumption was that Robert had suffered a tragic hunting accident, perhaps stumbling while carrying his rifle or experiencing a mechanical failure that caused an accidental discharge. Such accidents, while relatively rare, were not unheard of in rural Kentucky, where hunting was a way of life and firearms were as common as farm tools. But as Detective Santos and the crime scene investigators began examining the scene more carefully, details emerged that suggested Robert Mitchell's death was far more sinister than a simple hunting mishap. The trajectory of the bullet that killed Robert was inconsistent with an accidental shooting. According to the county medical examiner, the wound indicated that Robert had been shot from a distance of at least 50 yards by someone positioned at roughly the same height, not the kind of angle that would result from a dropped rifle or mechanical failure. More troubling was the fact that Robert's own rifle hadn't been fired that morning. The barrel was clean and there was no residue on his hands that would indicate he had discharged his weapon. Detective Santos, who had never fully accepted that Sarah's disappearance was random or unconnected to larger forces in the community, immediately suspected that Robert's death was linked to his daughter's case. Perhaps Robert had discovered something about what happened to Sarah, or perhaps someone believed he was getting too close to the truth. The timing seemed too coincidental. A father searching relentlessly for his missing daughter suddenly dies under suspicious circumstances, just as he was beginning to make noise about the sheriff's department's handling of the case. In the weeks before his death, Robert had been increasingly vocal about his dissatisfaction with the investigation into Sarah's disappearance. He had contacted the Kentucky State Police, asking them to review the case, and had even reached out to a private investigator in Louisville about conducting an independent investigation. Friends and neighbors reported that Robert had been asking new questions about the night Sarah vanished, trying to piece together a timeline of her final hours that might reveal something the police had missed. The autopsy results, released 2 weeks after Robert's death, confirmed Detective Santos's suspicions. Robert Mitchell had been murdered, shot at close range with a high-powered rifle by someone who knew the Mitchell property well enough to approach, undetected, and escape without being seen. The killer had positioned themselves in dense underbrush that provided excellent cover while offering a clear line of sight to the area where Robert typically set up his deer stand. The murder weapon was never found, despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding areas by both sheriff's deputies and Kentucky State Police investigators who had been called in to assist with the case. The killer had been careful, methodical, and had clearly planned the attack in advance. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity. It was an execution carried out by someone who wanted Robert Mitchell dead for reasons that remained terrifyingly unclear. Helen Mitchell, who had already endured 16 months of not knowing what happened to her daughter, was now faced with the additional trauma of losing her husband under equally mysterious circumstances. The 65-year-old woman, who had been the emotional anchor for her 5 grandchildren throughout Sarah's disappearance, suffered a complete emotional breakdown after Robert's funeral. She was hospitalized for severe depression and anxiety, leaving the children temporarily in the care of other family members while she struggled to process the magnitude of her losses. The connection between Sarah's disappearance and her father's murder seemed obvious to everyone in Willowbrook, but proving that connection was another matter entirely. Detective Santos and the expanded investigative team that now included Kentucky State Police detectives and FBI agents from the Louisville field office spent months looking for links between the two cases, but the perpetrator or perpetrators had been careful to leave little evidence behind. The double tragedy transformed the Mitchell family from objects of sympathy into something approaching local legends, a family seemingly cursed by forces beyond their control. Some residents whispered about old grudges or business deals gone wrong, while others speculated about drug connections or organized crime elements that might have infiltrated their quiet farming community. The theories grew more elaborate and conspiracy-minded with each retelling, but none of them brought the family any closer to answers. Jake Mitchell, who had planned to complete his military service and perhaps make a career in the army, requested a hardship discharge to return home and care for his younger siblings and grandmother. At 19, he found himself the de facto head of a family that had been shattered by 2 unsolved crimes, trying to hold together a household while dealing with his own grief and anger about the loss of both his mother and the grandfather who had stepped in to fill the void she left behind. The younger children struggled even more with Robert's death than they had with Sarah's disappearance. Sarah's vanishing, while traumatic, had left room for hope that she might someday return. But Robert's murder was final and brutal, a violent end to the man who had been their stability and protection during the most difficult period of their young lives. 8-year-old Tyler began having nightmares about bad men coming to hurt the rest of their family, while 14-year-old Madison developed an eating disorder that required professional treatment. The media attention that had faded after Sarah's case went cold was reignited by Robert's murder, but the coverage took on a different tone. National news outlets picked up the story of the Kentucky family that had been devastated by what appeared to be connected crimes, and reporters began digging into every aspect of the Mitchells' lives, looking for connections that might explain why they had become targets. Some of the media coverage was sympathetic, portraying the Mitchells as victims of a community that harbored dark secrets and protected dangerous criminals, but other coverage was more sensational, suggesting that the family might have been involved in illegal activities that had made them targets for violence. These allegations, while never substantiated, added to the family's suffering and made them reluctant to speak with reporters or participate in the investigation as openly as they had before. Detective Santos found herself working two interconnected cases that seemed designed to torment a single family, and the pressure to solve both crimes was enormous. The Kentucky State Police had assigned additional resources to what was now being called the Mitchell family murders, and the FBI had opened a parallel investigation looking into possible connections to organized crime or drug trafficking networks that might operate in rural Nelson County. But despite the increased attention and resources, both cases remained frustratingly unsolved. As 2017 dawned, the person or persons who had taken Sarah Mitchell and murdered her father had managed to commit two heinous crimes in a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and had done so without leaving enough evidence to identify them or establish a clear motive for the attacks. As Helen Mitchell slowly recovered from her breakdown and returned to caring for her grandchildren, the family lived under a shadow of fear that had never existed before. Robert's murder. Someone had killed the patriarch of their family in cold blood, and that same someone was still free, still living somewhere in or around Willowbrook, still potentially dangerous to the surviving members of the Mitchell clan. The hunting accident that wasn't an accident had added a new dimension of terror to an already unspeakable tragedy, and had raised questions that would haunt the family and the community for years to come. Who wanted the Mitchell family to suffer? What secrets were worth killing to protect? And how many more members of the family would have to die before the truth finally came to light? In the spring of 2023, nearly 8 years after Sarah Mitchell had vanished from that lonely stretch of Bloomfield Road, and 7 years after her father Robert had been gunned down in his own hunting woods, a breakthrough would finally pierce the darkness that had shrouded Willowbrook, Kentucky. The catalyst came not from traditional detective work or witness testimony, but from advances in forensic technology that had been unimaginable when Detective Santos first began investigating Sarah's disappearance. The Kentucky State Police had launched an ambitious cold case initiative, partnering with private laboratories to re-examine DNA evidence from hundreds of unsolved crimes, using techniques that could extract genetic profiles from samples previously considered too degraded or contaminated to be useful. The Mitchell cases, both Sarah's disappearance and Robert's murder, were selected for this advanced testing because of the high-profile nature of the crimes and the possibility that solving them might provide closure, not just for the family, but for a community that had lived under the shadow of these unsolved tragedies for nearly a decade. In March 2023, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic geneticist at Lexington's Advanced DNA Solutions Laboratory, made a discovery that would change everything. While reprocessing blood evidence collected from Sarah's abandoned Honda Pilot, evidence that had yielded only partial DNA profiles in 2015, her team was able to extract a complete genetic sequence using new amplification techniques. More significantly, when they ran this profile through the combined DNA index system TAUDIS database, they found a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Derek Lawson, a 45-year-old former Nelson County deputy sheriff, who had worked for the department from 2010. Lawson had been one of the responding officers during the initial search for Sarah, and had participated in several of the volunteer searches organized in the weeks following her disappearance. His DNA was in the system because Kentucky requires all law enforcement officers to provide samples for elimination purposes during investigations. Detective Santos, now a lieutenant after 8 years of exemplary service, felt her heart stop when she received the call from Dr. Walsh. Derek Lawson had been right there from the beginning, wearing a badge, carrying a gun, and earning the trust of the Mitchell family while hiding the most horrific secret imaginable. He had not only murdered Sarah, but had helped search for her body, had comforted her children, and had stood beside her parents during those agonizing early days when they still hoped she might be found alive. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Nelson County Sheriff's Department and the Kentucky State Police. Internal affairs investigators were immediately called in to determine how thoroughly Lawson had been vetted when he was hired, and whether there had been any warning signs of violent behavior that had been overlooked. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of a man who had used his position in law enforcement to hide a pattern of escalating criminal behavior. Further investigation revealed that Lawson had been suspected of but never charged with domestic violence incidents involving 2 different girlfriends during his time as a deputy. Both women had filed complaints against him but had later dropped the charges after reporting that they feared for their safety. Internal affairs records showed that Lawson had been counseled about inappropriate behavior toward female staff members and had been reprimanded twice for using excessive force during arrests, but had never faced serious disciplinary action. More chilling was the discovery that Lawson had accessed the Mitchell case files dozens of times over the years, officially as part of his duties, but clearly to monitor the progress of the investigation into his own crimes. He had known exactly what evidence investigators possessed, what leads they were following, and how close they were getting to identifying him as a suspect. This inside information had allowed him to stay one step ahead of the investigation for 8 years. But the DNA match was only the beginning of what investigators would uncover about Derek Lawson's involvement in the Mitchell family tragedies. When Kentucky State Police obtained search warrants for Lawson's property, an isolated farmhouse about 15 miles from where Sarah's car had been found, they discovered evidence that would answer questions that had haunted the community for nearly a decade. Hidden in a shed behind Lawson's house, wrapped in plastic and buried beneath bags of fertilizer, investigators found Sarah's clothing, her jewelry, and her cell phone. More horrifically, they found photographs, dozens of them, showing Sarah in various states of distress and terror, images that provided a glimpse into her final hours that was almost too disturbing to process. The photos proved that Sarah had been held captive for an extended period before she was killed, and that her death had been neither quick nor merciful. When confronted with this overwhelming evidence, Lawson's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. During a tense interrogation at Kentucky State Police headquarters in Louisville, with his lawyer present and cameras rolling, the former deputy sheriff confessed to crimes that shocked even seasoned investigators who thought they had seen everything. According to Lawson's confession, he had encountered Sarah by chance on the night of July 3, 2015, while driving through Willowbrook after finishing a shift. He claimed that he had initially approached her vehicle under the pretense of conducting a welfare check, using his badge and uniform to gain her trust. Sarah, believing she was dealing with a legitimate police officer, had allowed him to escort her to a supposedly safe location where they could discuss whatever problem had brought her out so late at night. Instead, Lawson had driven Sarah to his remote farmhouse, where he had held her captive for 3 days while the entire community searched frantically for her. His confession, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that chilled everyone in the interrogation room, detailed how he had tortured and sexually assaulted Sarah before finally strangling her when he grew tired of her pleas for mercy and her promises to remain silent if he would just let her return to her children. But the confession that truly devastated the Mitchell family and the Willowbrook community was Lawson's admission that he had also murdered Robert Mitchell. According to the former deputy, Robert had begun asking too many questions about the investigation, had started making connections between various pieces of evidence and was getting dangerously close to identifying inconsistencies in the official reports. Lawson claimed that Robert had approached him directly, sharing suspicions about police corruption and asking whether certain evidence had been properly processed. Realizing that Robert posed a threat to his freedom, Lawson had used his knowledge of the Mitchell family property, gained during the searches for Sarah, to plan Robert's murder. He had known about Robert's hunting schedule, had positioned himself in the woods before dawn, and had waited patiently for the opportunity to kill the man who was getting too close to the truth about his daughter's fate. The confession was a devastating blow to everyone who had worked the case. But it was particularly crushing for Detective Santos, who had developed a close relationship with the Mitchell family over the years and had promised them that she would never stop looking for answers. The arrest of Derek Lawson on March 15, 2023, sent shockwaves through Kentucky and made national headlines. The story of the trusted deputy sheriff, who had murdered a mother of 5 and then helped search for her body, became a symbol of corruption and betrayal that resonated far beyond the boundaries of Nelson County. Media outlets across the country picked up the story, focusing on the family's 8-year nightmare and the stunning revelation that their tormentor had been hiding in plain sight. For the Mitchell family, Lawson's confession brought both relief and renewed trauma. Helen Mitchell, now 72 years old and in declining health, wept when she learned that the questions that had haunted her family for 8 years finally had answers. But those answers were more horrific than anything she had imagined, and the knowledge of what Sarah had endured during her final days was almost more than she could bear. Jake Mitchell, now 26 years old and working as a construction foreman while caring for his younger siblings and grandmother, struggled with overwhelming rage when he learned the truth about Lawson. The man who had shaken his hand at his mother's memorial services, who had promised to never stop looking for her, who had been trusted with investigating her disappearance, had been the monster responsible for destroying his family. The younger Mitchell children, now young adults who had grown up in the shadow of their mother's disappearance and grandfather's murder, found themselves dealing with a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief in finally knowing what had happened, but also anger at the years of uncertainty they had endured, and horror at the realization that their family's trusted protector had been their greatest enemy. As Derek Lawson sat in a jail cell awaiting trial, the community of Willowbrook struggled to process the magnitude of his betrayal. The man who had worn a badge, who had sworn to protect and serve, who had been entrusted with the safety of their families, had used that trust to commit the most unspeakable crimes imaginable. The revelation forced difficult questions about how well anyone really knew their neighbors, and about whether the institutions they relied upon for protection could truly be trusted. But amid the shock and horror of Lawson's confession, there was also a sense of justice finally being served. After 8 years of silence, after 8 years of a family living without answers, the truth had finally emerged. Sarah Mitchell and Robert Mitchell would never return, but their killer would face judgment for his crimes, and their family could finally begin the long process of healing from wounds that had been left open for far too long. On a humid September morning in 2024, nearly 9 years after Sarah Mitchell had vanished into the Kentucky darkness, and 8 years after her father Robert had been murdered in his own hunting woods, the Nelson County Courthouse became the epicenter of one of the most anticipated trials in the state's recent history. The weathered limestone building, which had witnessed countless cases over its century-long existence, had never seen anything quite like the media circus and community attention that surrounded the prosecution of Derek Lawson. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating arranged in the hallway and dozens of reporters from national news outlets occupying every available space. In the front row, Helen Mitchell sat flanked by her 5 grandchildren, now young adults whose lives had been forever altered by Lawson's crimes. Her weathered hands clutched a tissue as she prepared to face the man who had destroyed her family while wearing the uniform of those sworn to protect it. Commonwealth's attorney Jennifer Harrison opened the trial with a presentation that left the packed courtroom in stunned silence. Using photographs, DNA evidence, and Lawson's own recorded confession, she methodically detailed how the former deputy sheriff had used his position of trust to commit unspeakable crimes against an innocent mother and her family. The evidence was overwhelming. Lawson's DNA on Sarah's abandoned vehicle, the photographs found hidden on his property, his detailed knowledge of the crime scenes that only the perpetrator could possess. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Harrison said, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger, "the defendant didn't just murder Sarah Mitchell and Robert Mitchell. He violated every oath he took as a law enforcement officer. He betrayed the trust of a community that looked to him for protection. And for 8 years, he watched this family suffer while he knew exactly what had happened to their loved ones." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence. Psychologists explained Lawson's predatory behavior patterns, and former colleagues reluctantly took the stand to describe his inappropriate conduct that had been overlooked for years. Most damaging was the playing of Lawson's full confession, his emotionless voice filling the courtroom as he described in clinical detail how he had murdered Sarah and later killed her father to cover up his crimes. When 26-year-old Jake Mitchell took the stand to deliver a victim impact statement, his words cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Derek Lawson didn't just kill my mother and grandfather," he said, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "He killed our family's ability to trust. He killed our sense of safety. He killed our faith that the people who wear badges are there to protect us, rather than harm us." Jake described how his siblings had grown up afraid, how his grandmother had never recovered from the double loss, how the family had lived in constant fear that whoever had committed these crimes might return to finish what they had started. "We never knew," he said, looking directly at Lawson, "that the monster was sitting right there with us at every memorial service, every press conference, every moment when we begged for help finding our mother." The defense, led by Lexington attorney Michael Chen, faced an almost impossible task. With Lawson's confession, the DNA evidence, and the photographs found on his property, there was little room to argue innocence. Instead, Chen attempted to portray his client as mentally ill, a man whose psychological problems had been exacerbated by the stress of law enforcement work and personal trauma from his military service years earlier. But the jury wasn't buying it. Dr. Patricia Wells, the court-appointed psychiatrist who had evaluated Lawson, testified that while he showed signs of antisocial personality disorder, he was fully competent and aware of his actions when he committed the murders. Mr. Lawson planned these crimes carefully, Dr. Wells testified. He used his law enforcement training to avoid detection, manipulated evidence, and showed sophisticated understanding of how to evade capture. This is not the behavior of someone who was mentally incapacitated. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which the citizens of Willowbrook and viewers across the nation were riveted by the testimony that revealed the full scope of Lawson's betrayal. Former girlfriends testified about his controlling behavior and threats of violence. Fellow deputies admitted they had suspected something was wrong, but had failed to report their concerns. The picture that emerged was of a dangerous predator who had used his badge as both camouflage and weapon. On October 12, 2024, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman, a retired teacher from Bardstown, stood and delivered the words that the Mitchell family had waited 9 years to hear. "We find the defendant, Derek Lawson, guilty of murder in the first degree in the death of Sarah Mitchell. We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree in the death of Robert Mitchell." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of sobs and sighs of relief. Helen Mitchell collapsed against her grandson Jake's shoulder, her body shaking with the release of nearly a decade of pent-up grief and anger. Outside the courthouse, supporters who had gathered throughout the trial cheered and embraced, while news reporters scrambled to broadcast the verdict to audiences who had followed the case for months. During the penalty phase of the trial, the prosecution argued forcefully for the death penalty, citing the heinous nature of the crimes and Lawson's abuse of his position as a law enforcement officer. But after extensive deliberation, the jury recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that Judge William Matthews accepted and imposed on November 5th. "Mr. Lawson," Judge Matthews said as he delivered the sentence, "you have committed crimes that shock the conscience of this community and this Commonwealth. You violated every oath you took as a law enforcement officer and betrayed the trust of people who looked to you for protection. While this court cannot restore the lives you took, it can ensure that you will spend the rest of your natural life in prison, where you can never again harm another innocent person." Lawson, who had remained largely emotionless throughout the trial, showed no reaction to the sentence. He was immediately transported to the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville, where he would spend the remainder of his life in isolation. His days as a predator finally ended. For the Mitchell family, the conclusion of the trial brought a complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and continued grief. Justice had finally been served. But it could not bring back Sarah or Robert, could not restore the childhood innocence that had been stolen from the 5 children, could not heal the trauma that would forever mark their lives. In the months following Lawson's conviction, Willowbrook began the long process of healing from wounds that had festered for nearly a decade. The revelation that their tormentor had been a trusted law enforcement officer forced difficult conversations about accountability, oversight, and the systems designed to protect communities from those who would do them harm. The Nelson County Sheriff's Department implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory psychological evaluations for all officers, enhanced background checks, and an independent civilian oversight board to investigate complaints of misconduct. These changes, while too late to help Sarah and Robert Mitchell, represented hope that future tragedies might be prevented. In the spring of 2025, the University of Louisville announced the establishment of the Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship for single mothers pursuing degrees in nursing or social work, the fields that Sarah had dreamed of entering before her life was cut short. The scholarship, funded by donations from across Kentucky and beyond, would ensure that Sarah's dream of helping others would live on through the women who followed in her footsteps. Helen Mitchell, now 74 and increasingly frail, found peace in the scholarship program and in watching her grandchildren begin to heal from their trauma. Jake had returned to college, studying criminal justice with the goal of becoming a victim's advocate. Madison was pursuing a degree in social work, determined to help other families navigate the aftermath of violent crime. The younger children were slowly learning to trust again, to believe that the world could be safe and good despite the evil they had witnessed. At the scholarship ceremony, held on what would have been Sarah's 45th birthday, Helen stood before an audience of hundreds and delivered words that captured both her loss and her hope. Sarah always believed in the power of second chances, in the ability of people to overcome their circumstances and build better lives. She said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. This scholarship isn't just about honoring her memory. It's about continuing the work she would have done if she had lived. The ceremony was attended by many of the law enforcement officers, community volunteers, and citizens who had searched tirelessly for Sarah in those early days of her disappearance. Detective Santos, now Chief of Detectives for the Nelson County Sheriff's Department, spoke about the importance of never giving up on victims or their families, even when cases grow cold and hope seems lost. But perhaps the most moving moment came when little Emma Mitchell, now 12 years old and bearing a striking resemblance to the mother she barely remembered, placed a bouquet of flowers at the base of a memorial tree planted in Sarah's honor. "I don't remember much about my mom," she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering, "but everyone tells me she was brave and kind, and that she loved us more than anything. I hope someday I can be like her." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, the Mitchell family gathered around the memorial tree, its branches reaching toward a clear Kentucky sky. They had survived the unthinkable, had endured nearly a decade of uncertainty and fear, and had finally seen justice served for the crimes that had shattered their world. The story of Sarah Mitchell would never truly end. It lived on in the scholarship recipients who would follow her dream of helping others in the law enforcement reforms that might prevent future tragedies, and in the example of a family that refused to let evil triumph over love, even in their darkest hours. Derek Lawson's betrayal had wounded Willowbrook deeply, but it had not broken the community's spirit. In the years that followed his conviction, the small Kentucky town would rebuild stronger than before, bound together by shared trauma, but also by shared determination that such evil would never again be allowed to hide behind a badge or exploit the trust of innocent people. And on quiet summer evenings, when the fireflies danced in the tall grass along Bloomfield Road, residents of Willowbrook could drive past the spot where Sarah's car had been found without the chill of fear that had haunted them for so many years. Justice had finally come to their community, late but inevitable, proving that even the most carefully hidden secrets cannot remain buried forever when people refuse to stop seeking the truth. Sarah Mitchell's legacy would live on, not in the manner of her death, but in the strength of those who loved her, the community that never forgot her, and the belief that justice, however long delayed, will ultimately prevail. Her story had become a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of accountability, and the unbreakable bonds of family that even the most heinous crimes cannot destroy. In the end, Derek Lawson had taken 2 lives, but he had failed in his ultimate goal of escaping justice. The badge he had dishonored, the trust he had betrayed, and the family he had tried to destroy had all played roles in his eventual downfall. And in the quiet farming community of Willowbrook, Kentucky, Sarah Mitchell's name would be remembered not as a victim, but as a symbol of the truth that no crime, no matter how carefully concealed, can remain hidden forever when good people refuse to stop seeking justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our investigations into cases where justice eventually prevails, no matter how long it takes. Because every victim deserves to have their story told, and every family deserves to know the truth.